Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's Zoom session. My name is David Halperin, CEO of Israel Policy Forum. Let me be the very last person to wish you a Happy New Year. And we are here to discuss the year that has been and the year that might be, as we are now concluding year one of the second term of the Trump administration, at a time of incredible consequence in the Trump administration's moves internationally, and especially in the Israeli-Palestinian arena, where just in recent days, the Trump administration announced the beginning of phase two of the Gaza ceasefire, including this concept of the Board of Peace, that has both incredibly important and some very peculiar, let's say, elements, which we'll unpack in today's session. As always, thank you so much for joining us. And if you're new to Israel Policy Forum, I hope this is the first of many engagements you'll have with us. Today's session, I'm very pleased to be joined by both old colleagues and new colleagues. First with us is Michael Koplow, our Chief Policy Officer. For now more than a decade, Michael has been the voice of Israel Policy Forum through his weekly Koplow column, providing nuanced analysis and in-depth expertise on issues impacted U.S.-Israel relations, Israeli politics, and the American Jewish community. Also joining us is Rachel Brandenburg, who's been with us actually just for about a year as our Washington Managing Director and Senior Policy Analyst. Rachel has spent years working in Washington at various levels of government in Capitol Hill, at the Pentagon, at the Defense Department, and with various think tanks. And we're thrilled to be joined by Rachel. And lastly, we are welcoming to our team Dan Rothem as our new Senior Policy Analyst based in Israel. Dan is actually an old friend. Even if he's new to the team, it certainly doesn't feel that way. We've worked very closely with Dan over the years. In his role most recently, I should say, in his role as a researcher at Tachlit, in the Israeli institute known as the Institute for Israeli Policy in Israel, in his role as the CEO of the Commanders for Israel Security Movement, and his many years as an analyst and researcher for the S. Daniel Abraham Center for Middle East Peace. And of course, we've all been long fans of Dan. Most notably, of course, I must say, is his famous baseball career, really serving as a pioneer of Israeli baseball, including, I have to embarrass you a bit, Dan, being the pitcher at the historic game between Israel and Saudi Arabia in the late 1980s, playing against largely American expats on the Saudi team. Dan, remind us what the final score was of the Israel versus Saudi Arabia game.
Oh, you're bringing the noise right off the bat. So we lost 51-0, but nonetheless, we were the first normalizers.
There you go. Progress nonetheless. Progress nonetheless. So anyway, Dan, thank you so much to our team. We have so much to unpack. We will, as I promised, talk about the year that's been, the year that will come, and specifically the Board of Peace. And I want to start with a kind of two-part question for each of you, which is, how is Trump 2.0 different than the original? And what have we seen accomplished thus far 1 year into this 2.0 version? Perhaps, Rachel, I'll start with you.
Thanks, David. You mentioned, Dan mentioned noise. I think there's been a lot of noise this first year. But when I think about what characterizes the first term versus the second term of Trump, I think of the first term as disruption. I was in our government, US government, still for the first year of that term. And things were a little bit different. The Trump administration was trying to find their way around, literally like through the front door of buildings, figure out how the government worked. They really didn't come in expecting to win or with much prepared to figure out what they wanted to do, but they were testing new norms. They were trying new things. There were some people who were sort of your traditional suspects appointed as political officials in government and others who were new, but it didn't feel all that different initially. It got increasingly more different and increasingly less traditional as the term went on, but it wasn't quite destruction. This term, I think, has been characterized, at least this year, the first year of this term has been characterized in my mind as more about destruction. They've decided that traditional ways of doing business just isn't the way they want to go about doing business now. In the case of many foreign policy initiatives, President Trump has come out and said exactly that. Old ways of doing business, old ways of security assistance, foreign assistance, interventionism haven't worked, and we're going to try things differently. They came in swinging internally and decimated parts of our domestic policy and government. They don't really have much regard for norms. They have a mixed regard for laws, but they're just trying new things. And to their credit, in some ways, those new things have worked. I think with respect to Israel and Gaza and Israel-Palestine, they concluded a second ceasefire. They have brought home all living hostages and all but one deceased hostages, which they came in intent to do from day one. And they're trying to hold together the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas and between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon, so far successfully. I know we'll get into more of the details on that in a little bit. But I think we have yet to see whether this approach of kind of slash, burn, and then try to rebuild will actually lead to rebuilding. A lot has been promised and a lot has been said, but not all that much has been delivered in this first year. Then again, it's only been 1 year and there are 3 more. So I don't know that anyone expects everything to be rebuilt in the initial 365 days, but we'll see.
Yeah. I want to turn to Michael and then Dan, but let me first remind the audience that there won't be a Q&A session formally. I really welcome your questions throughout today's discussion, so please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to type in your question. We'll try to get to as many as we can throughout the call. Michael, 2.0, different than the original, in your view and your sense of accomplishments at year one?
I'll build a little bit off of what Rachel said in terms of disruption in the first term versus destruction in this one. To me, the biggest difference is that there are no restraints on Trump, including the ones that many of us assumed would be there. I wrote and probably talked about it on a webinar at some point, just over a year ago, about how I thought that the Gulf countries, for instance, were going to exercise a lot of influence over Trump for a variety of reasons, whether it was personal business ties, because he seems to gravitate toward the Gulf countries. He likes them. He likes their leaders. He seems to want their respect and sometimes their approval. And to be honest, I haven't seen that much evidence that there are any countries that really can sway him. He's sort of upset everybody in different ways and in different arenas. And there was all sorts of speculation about what the Gulf countries wanted with regard to Iran. I feel like I'm on pretty safe ground saying that before the 12-day war in June, most of those countries did not want strikes on Iran because they were worried that anything like that would spiral out of control into a wider regional war. It ended up only being 12 days and being constrained. So I think from their perspective, things were okay. But they didn't want it, and Trump didn't seem to particularly care. We see this, of course, playing out in all sorts of ways with regard to Europe, and just in the last couple of days, all the stuff over Greenland, and with regard to Israel as well. I think that there are people who thought that somehow Israel was going to be different, that whatever the Trump doctrine is, Israel would be treated in a special way. And certainly there are some things that the Israelis have been happy with, the war in Iran first and foremost, and U.S. involvement in Operation Midnight Hammer. But when we look at things like what's going on in Gaza, there the Israelis have been, I think, largely disappointed in many ways. We talk about Trump's accomplishments. The big one is the ceasefire and the return of all the hostages, with the exception of the body of Ron Gvili. And this is a genuine accomplishment. I'm not sure that the ceasefire and the way it was ended in phase one are what Prime Minister Netanyahu and the government actually would have wanted had they been able to choose. It was effectively forced on them by Trump even before he took office, just through the specter of his arriving presence. And certainly since then, we've seen all sorts of squabbling, usually behind the scenes, then gets reported. And this week too, with the creation of the Board of Peace, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a little bit, the Israelis are upset over the involvement of Turkey, over the involvement of Qatar, over the fact that there certainly is unofficial PA representation or at least DPA connections on the National Committee for the Administration of Gaza, the Palestinian Technocratic Committee. So, we're seeing that the Israelis don't really have a way of restraining or controlling Trump either. And obviously, during his first term, there was the sense that Trump was of course very different and operated in different ways. But I think there was always this idea that there were some actors out there that could perhaps weigh in and get him to change course. And I'm not sure that we've seen evidence of that this time around with any actor or really in any sphere of policy.
So before I turn to Dan for the view from Israel on this, I actually want to stick with Rachel and Michael for just another second because Michael, you referred to the notion of the Trump doctrine, whatever that is. We've at times talked about Trump the isolationist or the isolationist wing of the administration. It now clearly is Trump the interventionist. Venezuela, Greenland, investing the United States in the Board of Peace in really historic, transformative ways. What is the Trump doctrine, if there was one, as you see it?
I'll punt this. I'll punt this to Rachel after about 10 seconds. I don't know. I don't know that there's a Trump doctrine beyond whatever he wakes up deciding he wants to do. It seems to be some combination of his very very personal interests, right? It seems now that perhaps everything going on with Greenland is literally because he hasn't gotten a Nobel Peace Prize from the Norwegians. But I don't know that there's a coherent doctrine. I really think it's the whim of one person, and that's the strange place to be.
Yeah, Michael and I didn't coordinate this answer, but I agree. I think we're seeing a lot of personality politics. And I don't think of it so much as Trump the interventionist, but more Trump going for what Trump wants. And often that's sort of Trump the bully or Trump playing king and everyone else in the world a subject. And so far, he hasn't failed in big enough ways to have him change course. I mean, I think you can often find the underlying link to US national security interests in maybe the thing that Trump is going after or a motivation for what he is doing. But then it's taken either out of proportion or sort of complete hard left from anything that might be more effective. And I think of the Board of Peace as among these things, where the idea was sanctioned by the UN as part of the Trump's 20-point plan. Where it has ended up so far, and we'll see what happens at Davos this week, is quite different from what was alluded to in the initial 20-point plan that was supported by the UN and lots of other countries individually. I won't get into Greenland, but everything he could ostensibly be rationally going after in Greenland, you can achieve through partnership. You can achieve through diplomacy. Instead, he's on this campaign to annex or take over Greenland in ways that seem comical as a bystander, but really dangerous given that it's sort of real life.
Dan, from Israel, the view of the Trump administration, of course, is one that has been highly effective and is broadly popular among Israelis. What is your view from Israel on 2.0 versus the original and the accomplishments thus far?
So from here, the first Trump administration, he was very involved in Israel. At the time, everything seemed personal with his son-in-law and the ambassador here being very close to him and sort of like pulling him this way, but there was not a real, national security interest of America to be involved. And ultimately, he put forth his Peace to Prosperity plan together with, obviously, Netanyahu, Dermer, and the rest. And that was the extent of his real involvement. Obviously, before that, recognized Jerusalem, moved the embassy. But all that stuff was like internally motivated, if you would, by the people around him. and through him also recognition of Golan, I should mention. I think Trump 2.0 really entered a dramatically different context. He inherited an active war that consumed the attention of certainly the region, if not, much beyond that. Sort of like, Bush Jr., Bush 43, who stepped into office with the raging second intifada already in play. Um, um, but Trump here effectively, ultimately stopped the war. I mean, he stopped it for a while for this in January, let it resume, but ultimately was able to stop it in what for now seems to be, I believe it's 100 days since the ceasefire, or just about, and more than just effectively executing what ultimately became phase one. With obviously captive release, enhanced humanitarian aid. He also codified phase two, what Gaza's day after would look like. So a lot of people, including IPF, have put forth ideas of what that should be. But he was the one that would basically got all the relevant international and regional stakeholders and got Israel and Hamas to agree enough to that plan so that it could hold. And now we're in this weird attempt to transition from phase one to phase two. I'll just note one more thing. Obviously, that when you look regionally, Israel is very much like the Trump support, at least for Israel's relative freedom of action, certainly in Iran, as Michael noted, and Rachel, but also in Lebanon, to a certain extent, the freedom to act in Syria. And so Israel and security apparatus view Trump 2.0 very favorably, at least early on.
So, and I think it's worth underscoring that the Trump administration, at least at this point, clearly, and I've said this in various ways many times over, that this administration clearly is the most influential or consequential or carries the most weight in the region of any presidency, really for decades at this point. The challenge is what to do with that influence moving forward. And Dan, before we get to the Board of Peace, I want to reflect back on when we were all in Israel together not too long ago, and the conversation was not necessarily about phase two, which had yet to be launched, but about the coming resumption of violence. The assumption that there could be a return to hostilities in Gaza, if not Lebanon, if not Iran. And it has been remarkable to see the Trump administration balance the potential of military conflict with the potential of diplomacy. I wonder, what do you make of the last few weeks, the potential of American intervention in Iran and the state of play in Gaza and Lebanon? And I'll ask the same of Rachel and Michael.
I'll defer to my American colleague as far as the probabilities of American military intervention in Iran, the second one, we should note. As for the potential for resumed escalation in Lebanon and Gaza, I think that's still very much on the table. The timing was not right for all kinds of reasons a few weeks ago. I think Trump's team very much wants to see, to maintain a window for diplomacy, if you would, to resolve this Gaza thing, or at least to start pushing well into phase two. But if that proves impossible or stuck, and if the blame game is won in the sense that Hamas, it is mainly to be blamed for not being able to move into phase two, then I think a green light for a serious kinetic action west of the yellow line, much more than is ongoing right now, is very much in the cards. I think the window for that is, say, spring, maybe early summer. I'll defer to you guys as far as the midterm campaign in the United States and how that will affect anything. But certainly I see Trump as unpredictable and, as Rachel said, willing to deploy all tools in the national security toolbox and, whiplash us all between one and the other. That is, I think, we can't remove that from what is possible to come.
Rachel, let me turn to you. Same question.
Sure. Yeah, I'll pick up on what Dan mentioned about tools of national security. And when I was in grad school, I TA'd a course taught by former Secretary of State, the late Madeleine Albright, and she would talk about the tools of national security and how there was always sort of intentionality and strategy and the different tools that could be deployed at different times. I don't know that we've seen a president try to deploy all tools at the same time with as little strategy as we see, as I interpret now with President Trump. And I think we had this conversation about a year ago where I said then, and I still think that the sheer unpredictability of his behavior and his sheer willingness to buck norms and do what no one thought a US president would do still lends him some amount of leverage. I wonder if that gets old after a while and if world leaders start reacting differently or other countries start reacting differently. We've sort of seen to date a number of heads of state try to figure out what it is he wants and play to his ego and preempt him in giving him what he wants in order to curry favor. But I think we're increasingly seeing that you still don't know what you're going to get. But I also think something we talked about a year ago still stands. As much as the president uses force and is not shy about it, and I think I've been surprised how much he's willing to deploy military assets, he still doesn't seem to want a war. He likes victory. He likes the images of victory. And so far, we've seen him deploy things that either are sort of surgical strikes or have a high likelihood of success. U.S. military involvement in Iran was a one-time thing. We dropped big bombs on Fordo, and that basically halted the war for the moment. Even what happened in Venezuela a couple weeks ago, it was a singular strike, and we haven't intervened further. I think part of the calculus in not striking Iran last week, when we all thought that U.S. intervention in Iran was imminent, was that it's more complicated. And no single strike, no single use of force was going to yield the sort of immediate quick win that the president likes. So we'll see where things go from here. But he's always sort of doing both at the same time, negotiating and threatening or using force with some sanctions thrown in. I think instead of what we knew to be foreign assistance, now it's sort of backroom deals and private money to try and win folks over. So it's a slight shift on what I think many of us learned and saw in years past, but I'm not sure where it's going to go.
Great. So I want to thank people who've been putting in questions. We're going to get to lots of questions, and I welcome more. If you have a question, you can type in the Q&A box. I want to get to the developments over the weekend before we turn into many issues that are being raised in the questions. But really over the weekend, late last week, the announcement of the Board of Peace, numerous countries being invited, the formation of a technocratic committee with Donald Trump at its head with multiple executive boards. What to make of this strange organizational chart and strange charter? And can it genuinely be effective in advancing a reconstruction process for Gaza with the International Stabilization Force, the security mechanism yet to be announced, and still the looming question about disarmament and future of Hamas? Michael, I want to turn to you to try to walk us through what we know and what we don't know.
Sure, with try being the operative word there, because there's a lot of overlapping structures here, and I think it's too early to say definitively what we know. So we have a number of things, right? We have the Board of Peace that Trump chairs, and he's announced so far lots of countries have been invited, right? And I think the ones that have accepted so far it's what, Argentina, Hungary, Kazakhstan, Morocco. Today we had the UAE and Belarus, Vietnam, right? Thank you. Maybe more by the time we're done with this webinar. So, what's interesting is that the Board of Peace is the thing that's in the 20-point plan, and the UN Security Council resolution gives the Board of Peace a 2-year charter to basically run Gaza. But then we see this Board of Peace document that the Trump administration has circulated that came out on Saturday and doesn't actually mention Gaza anywhere in it. The Board of Peace seems, to me at least, to be this thing that Trump is trying to create that's going to supplant other institutions. Maybe the UN Security Council, maybe he envisions it supplanting NATO. It's unclear. But it's supposed to be this thing that lasts literally until he decides to dissolve it as chairman. And countries get initial 3-year terms, but you can get a permanent term if after or within the first year you pay Donald Trump $1 billion. So, maybe this is related to Gaza in some way, and maybe it's supposed to be larger conflicts, and maybe this is just another way in which the president seems to be monetizing all sorts of things. But I think, at this point, based on what we've seen, we kind of have to put the Board of Peace to one side because it's not exactly so far Gaza related.
Is the $1 billion supposed to be paying Donald Trump, or is that towards investment, reconstruction? It's unclear.
Doesn't say it because, again, the words Gaza don't appear anywhere in the Board of Peace charter. It's unclear what the $1 billion is going to, membership dues.
Yeah.
But important to note that Trump is chairman of the Board of Peace for life until he decides otherwise, and he's the person who appoints the next chairman. So who knows what this money will actually go to. Then we have this executive board for the Board of Peace, and again this seems like it's more related to Gaza. He named Jared Kushner, Steve Witkoff, and Marco Rubio, Tony Blair, Nikolai Mladenov, a few others. And this is supposed to be, I guess, the operational arm of the Board of Peace. And then we have this second executive board. This one is called the Gaza Executive Board. And this seems far more directly Gaza related. Again, it's many of the same people: Kushner, Witkoff, Mladenov, Tony Blair, Mark Rowan from Apollo Global Management. But here we also have the Hakan Fidan, the Turkish foreign minister, and we have a Qatari official as well, an Egyptian official, so an Emirati official. So this seems to be much more related to Gaza itself. And then the president, I think, announced that these people would each have sort of distinct portfolios in terms of different things in Gaza. And then we have this thing called the National Committee for the Administration of Gaza, which is the Palestinian Technocratic Committee, and it's run by Ali Shat, a former PA official. And some of the people on the National Committee for the Administration of Gaza, the NCAG, do have PA links, are former PA officials. There's a former PA security force official there who's in charge of security. But many of them are not directly linked to the PA. They're technocrats of various sorts. And this is the body that's supposed to run the day-to-day of Gaza. Now, this body at the moment is in Cairo. Unclear when they're supposed to go to Gaza. Unclear when that's going to happen. Unclear what they're actually running. Because at least so far, it doesn't seem as if they have a budget. The International Stabilization Force does have a commander. Jasper Jeffers, a U.S. general, was named as the commander of the force, but the force itself so far doesn't exist, and nobody has stepped up to volunteer to contribute to it. So, we have now all these overlapping bodies, but it's unclear what authorities they have, where their budgets are coming from, what they actually control, and ultimately, the biggest problem is that Israel controls 53% of Gaza and Hamas controls 47% of Gaza. I don't think that Israel is going to step aside and say, hey, Gaza Executive Board and Palestinian Technocratic Committee and ISF go and do whatever you like in our 53%. Hamas has said that they're willing to turn over administration of Gaza to the Palestinian Technocratic Committee, but they're not actually going to give up control. They're not actually going to disarm, at least not yet, not without some better plan. So where all of these different things are going to operate, I think, is still unclear. And I'll quote our friend Nimrod Novik, who's been, and I hope he doesn't mind me borrowing this line. I'm attributing it to him, but he's been using the line that they've created the penthouse, but they haven't created the foundation or any of the floors below it. And I think that that is an apt metaphor for what we see here. We have this shiny Board of Peace, but it's unclear what's actually undergirding it.
Dan, there's been a lot of chatter in the Israeli press in recent days about the Turks and the Qataris being included in this board of peace without Israeli veto, I guess one would say. And of course, the Palestinian Authority links that Michael referenced is certainly not the sort what Netanyahu has long envisioned of no Abbas, no Hamas, no PA links. What is the discussion like in Israel as we begin to learn more about who's invited to the Board of Peace and what it actually has the mandate to begin to do?
So indeed, the chatter here is less about the big board of peace, right? All the countries that have joined that may join, to this body that will assume probably a greater role than just Gaza. Most of the focus was on the Gaza executive board and the presence of Qatar and Turkey in it. By the way, they are not the same, although both have backed Hamas. They're not the same. I think the Israel view of Qatar is quite complicated, and Israel is obviously we've chosen to negotiate, certainly lastly on the captive release, but even before that on stabilizing Gaza, even before October 7th, through the Qataris. We did not have to do that. We could have gone the Egyptian way, but we opted for Qatar, and Qatar is viewed certainly by the Prime Minister's office, influenced heavily also by the Americans, and not just the Trump administration, also the Biden administration, as a very viable avenue to try and move, at the very least, move Hamas. Turkey is a different matter. Turkey is viewed in Israel as a strategic foe, with some Israeli thinkers, and these are not like right-wing hawks necessarily, think that a clash is almost inevitable over the next decade with Turkey. Their presence, and especially their willingness and motivation to put troops on the ground, was viewed here with extreme caution, to say the least. And their presence, drew a lot of concern here. With that said, I must say that we in Israel, we walked ourselves into this corner fair and square when we vetoed any mention of the PA, and I mean meaningful mention of the PA, the veto over any mentioning of a political framework, a two-state framework, a pathway, all kinds of irreversible pathway, all kinds of terminologies that have been deployed over the past 2 years. And by that, we have, if you would, stiff-armed the Saudis, certainly, and there could have been a different coalition that would have been willing to step up and help stabilize Gaza, that would have been much more favorable to Israeli interests. But by vetoing the PA and an ultimate two-state outcome, certainly not a Palestinian state here and now, we have created a vacuum that only Turkey and Qatar can fill, and here we are.
Rachel, there's lots of questions I want to get to. I promise we will, about the West Bank and about Israeli elections, and I do want to come back to you, Dan, about this question of how you actually move forward on disarmament. But Rachel, I really am curious your take on the Board of Peace and where we go. What are you watching for in terms of the next steps in this process?
Yeah, I think, like Michael said, I think of the Board of Peace as sort of distinct from what happens on the ground, not the least of which because it doesn't actually mention Gaza, so who knows what direction it takes. It's among the areas where I think the genesis of it made a lot of sense. What it is turning into is more questionable. I also think for some of the actors who we would think of as more inherently involved in Israel-Palestine or in Israeli-Palestinian matters, who have a bit more of a stake in Gaza, the regional players who Dan mentioned, and some of the Europeans, it's complicated whether to join the Board of Peace, especially without direct reference to Gaza, is not just about Gaza. It is about, do we sign up for this thing that may or may not be what we think it is, with a president who is directly challenging our own authority on any list of, name your issue across the globe, with other unsavory characters who we don't want to get in bed with. And so it'll be interesting over the next week to see who else jumps on board, what else other countries say about it, if they're either able to differentiate between, I'm going to do X on Gaza while doing Y on Greenland, Ukraine, Venezuela, the Middle East, any number of other issues, or if they try and play Trump's game and make it a quid pro quo. We'll join your board of peace if you do something else. So I'm watching that out of interest, but I think more salient to what happens in Gaza is what comes of some of the lower levels of the non-existent structure that Michael described, like the executive committee, like the Palestinian Technical Committee. What role does Ladenov start playing? What becomes of the CMCC that was stood up a few months ago, that sort of, for better or worse, is no longer talked about quite as much now that these other layers have come into play? And is there a way that tangible progress can be made in Gaza for Gazans while some of this diplomatic theater goes on off to the side?
Yeah, and CMCC referencing the Civil Military Coordination Center in Kiryat Gat, where they have American military and other countries represented, in theory, to oversee Gaza and also the international security force that is yet to be created. Rachel also mentioned Nikolai Mladenov, this very accomplished, highly respected former UN special envoy with whom we've had many conversations over the years to oversee this. Dan, I know that for IPF, you're beginning to look at the question of disarmament, but how do we even begin to address the question of how do you disarm Hamas? Because, it seems that there will need to be some form of Hamas acquiescence to this new technocratic committee doing its work on the ground. And how do you even gain that when it is still, ostensibly serving as an independent militia and terror organization operating the Gaza Strip? What do you make of how you move from here to there, Dan?
So I get to solve the Gaza question in 3 minutes now.
Exactly.
Here. Okay.
30 seconds, go.
I'll do my best, but maybe I'll start with some credit to the Trump team.
Mhm.
First of all, getting Israeli-Palestinian issues right is really, really hard on its own, even if you're not,
Amen. Yeah.
doing all that. These guys, and I'm saying this to their credit, are moving fast, and they're not afraid of making errors. I mean, they don't frame it as errors. They're not afraid of trying, and if stuff doesn't work out, you pivot. Okay, Exhibit A, obviously, and this wasn't a good move by, at least certainly not morally and not geopolitically, not everything. But when Trump, off the cuff, decided that Palestinians should leave Gaza and the U.S. should take it over and whatever, and then he pivoted it from it. And in the 20-point plan, you saw explicit statements to the contrary. What I'm saying is these guys really don't care about, they don't see themselves beholding to anything that preceded, including their own words. Finally, he's willing to confront, obviously, foes and friends, and we've talked about this enough. So in that sense, I don't disagree with Nimrod, who's not here, but we're referring to him about the penthouse and everything that comes underneath it. I think these guys are just putting whatever they can in play. Okay, and if they could have put also the ISF in play, they would have, but that doesn't come together yet. So they put other stuff in play. Another question is, how do you sequence this? So I think the NCAG, assuming it can cross into Gaza, that's relatively the lower hanging fruit. Hamas has always been willing to hand off civilian governance to a different actor. On the disarmament, right now we don't see a coherent strategy emerging. I think the U.S. team and other relevant stakeholders still haven't figured out to what extent they want to negotiate that, have a negotiated agreement with Hamas over the question of weapons. It has its opportunities, but also its limitations, or to what extent they want to pressure and coerce Hamas and put in play meaningful, kinetic action in trying to do that. And apparently, if early on they thought that perhaps some regional actors or external actors would be willing to at least, participate in such pressure, now it is clear that only Israel is the actor that is willing to really send its forces down to try and disarm and demilitarize Gaza by use of force. So the conversation around disarmament is somewhat incoherent right now. And as we look into this, we at the very least try to put some order in that discussion. Look what kind of toolbox you need to deploy in order to maybe get agreement with Hamas. Look at the limitations of resumed war in trying to disarm Hamas. And we're also going to investigate, we'll call it non-kinetic coercion, all kinds of means to pressure Hamas without resuming full war, and to basically try and see to what extent each of these strategies can meet the desired objective of disarming Hamas, demilitarizing Gaza, and ushering a new era that is really post-conflict recovery and stabilization.
Michael, we had a question from Alexander Lungarov about how do we expect U.S. officials, Mladenov and others, to respond if Hamas does not come to some form of agreement to end armed resistance. Do we have any sense of the preparedness to enable Israel to go back into fighting? What is your sense on what happens if they don't disarm?
So I may be alone here in this room with this opinion, but it's very difficult for me to see a world in which Trump gives Israel a green light to really go back into Gaza in a serious way. And I say that because Trump is very good at creating his own reality. We've seen that in all sorts of ways. It's frankly how he got the ceasefire, right? He announced that Hamas accepts the ceasefire when Israel said that Hamas didn't, and he basically just made it happen. And one of the things he's been doing since is talked about the fact that he has solved the Gaza conflict and he's brought peace to the Middle East for the first time in 3,000 years. I think he's probably going to be pretty reluctant to give that up and to admit that actually it didn't work and the war is not over and Israel has to go back in. It's not impossible, right? There is one thing that I think to Trump's benefit. Well, obviously, in some ways, he's the least transparent president we've ever had. In other ways, he's the most transparent president we've ever had. He'll say that he's going to do something, and people all dismiss it as ridiculous, and then he goes and he does it, which is why I wouldn't put anything past him on Greenland. Here he's threatened Hamas a number of times, said that if they don't disarm, then there's going to be hell to pay, and we've seen him say this before, but I wouldn't 100% rule out him doing it. But I also think that if that happens, it not only destroys this narrative he's created, he has worked to put this extensive architecture in place, whether it's the Board of Peace or the Executive Board of the Board of Peace or the Executive Board for Gaza or the NCAG. He's got Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner working all sorts of conflicts, but this may be the one that's the most high profile and the one in which they've spent the most time. So I think it would be a huge step back for him to say, you know what, this didn't work. Israel, go back in and destroy Hamas. And I think that if Hamas indeed does not disarm and does not comply with anything, in the 20-point plan, it actually lays out very clearly what's supposed to happen. It says that if Hamas doesn't disarm and doesn't comply, then the plan is going to be carried out in the portion of Gaza that Hamas does not control. And from everything that I have seen and heard, including when Rachel and Dan and I did a bunch of meetings in Israel last month, it seems that there are all sorts of plans right now for what's going to happen in the Israeli-controlled portion with regard to planned communities and reconstruction and trying to get Palestinians to move there. And so I expect that will be where the thrust of the effort is. But again, you never know with Trump. I could be completely wrong on this.
So we're 45 minutes into this webinar, and we haven't talked about the West Bank yet. And Michael, I want to stay with you for a moment because your first column of the year of 2026 was essentially a prediction that the West Bank is going to be the arena to watch in the coming year. We have multiple questions about the state of the West Bank from board member Bob Sugarman, from longtime friend and former America's Peace Now leader Ori Neer, about the Trump administration's seeming lack of focus on the announcement of settlements of the ongoing settler violence. How does the West Bank factor in, and how do you see it shaping in ways that we should be watching in the weeks and months to come?
I haven't seen a whole lot of evidence yet that it factors into the administration's thinking on issues in a big way. We have seen them push back a bit on settler violence issues. We have seen them sometimes seem to be a little out of whack with some of the settlement announcements, but certainly not with all of them. We have seen them push the Israelis on PA issues. They seem to not want the PA to collapse financially. The reporting is that they've been pushing the Israelis on things like even Allenby Bridge or the Rafah crossing, and certainly on transfer of tax revenues and other financial issues with regard to the PA. With all that said, we're seeing a literal settlement bonanza with this Israeli government, including I think over either yesterday or over the weekend, Bezalel Smotrich went and laid the cornerstone for a new settlement in the Gush Etzion block. So, these things are proceeding full steam ahead. I think that the only reason that the government hasn't collapsed yet, I think the only reason that Smotrich in particular has stayed, is because he's basically getting everything he wants on the West Bank, and he knows that his time here is limited, and he's trying to push through as much as he can, as fast as he can. And the administration doesn't seem to be standing in the way, whether it's because they don't appreciate the enormity of what's going on, or because they see it as ancillary or not such a big deal, or maybe they actually actively support it. It's very difficult to say. But things in the West Bank are proceeding, like I said, at a pace that we've literally never seen. And I think that unless the administration gets wise to this pretty quickly, there's going to be an enormous amount of damage done this year that is going to be very difficult and in some cases impossible to completely walk back.
So, Rachel, we have a question from Barbara Landau about the Board of Peace essentially undermining NATO and perhaps the UN in this wider perspective or mandate. And I wonder how you see how does this either challenge that international order, or how does this challenge reconstruction in Gaza? And do you see this actually happening? Like, what are the next steps in this phase? And if not, how would it begin to unravel?
Sure. I don't really see the Board of Peace challenging NATO. I don't see it challenging the UN. I don't see it having the capacity to pose a real challenge to the international order in and of itself. I think Trump is doing many other things to pose a challenge to the international order and will continue doing so. The Board of Peace itself doesn't worry me because the players aren't, with all due respect, they're just not heavyweights yet. And I think it would take far more of them and a far more diverse array of actors to really be enough of a counterweight to institutions like NATO or the UN. I do think it challenges reconstruction in Gaza because it risks diminishing of the seriousness of the effort to reconstruct Gaza. Also, to pick up on the credit that Dan was giving the Trump administration earlier, the 20-point plan was a real feat to achieve and to get the amount of support from individual countries, from the UN, from the Arab League. I mean, he had the whole world lined up in support of Trump's 20-point plan. And the UN vote, there have been some smart diplomatic moves to build support for that, including from Israel, from actors who don't necessarily agree with all of it, but want enough to see real progress in Gaza and a real end to the war in Gaza and the broader Israeli-Palestinian conflict, that they were willing to take a chance and support what was sort of a set of principles laid out as a plan, even though nobody knew what the details were going to look like. I think if the details start looking um, less pragmatic, less well-intentioned, then it risks taking away from the potential for the plan itself to work. And then you have to wonder who does raise the money for Gaza, who is in charge of sort of moving that plan forward if the president is focused on the 20-point plan. Does that become sort of the heads of state off to the side and the other layers work on Gaza itself? Or does that really just distract from the whole effort?
Hmm. So, Dan, I want to come back to you on the Israeli context because the Board of Peace not only needs Hamas to cooperate for it to succeed, the new technical committee, but also the Israeli government. We have many questions about the current coalition and future elections. Herschel Richmond, Michael Goldstein, many others who've asked about this, which is you have to what extent is the current governing coalition in Israel actually committed to seeing the success of phase two, particularly as we're entering into an election year in which there is all sorts of election posturing taking place with Finance Minister Smotrich just the other day saying the time has come actually to dismantle the CMCC and for Israel to reoccupy and resettle the Gaza Strip. What do you make of this governing coalition enabling Trump and this second phase to succeed? And, you know, adding to that, what, how does the upcoming elections impact all of this?
Okay, so very quickly on second phase, I think somebody employed, I forget who, the term buyer's remorse. There was some stuff in the 20-point plan in the second phase of it. There's a key part that Israel really likes, right? And at the time, really wanted to get behind. That is the disarmament of Hamas, right? With support of external actors or not, but that they would buy at any point, without wasting Israeli blood and money in order to get that. But the cost of of allowing into Gaza all kinds of stuff and actors that certainly this coalition doesn't want to do. On that, there's big buyer's remorse, and to this point, at least Smotrich, who holds a veto power over the existence of this government, for most of the past 2 years, Smotrich has restrained himself as far as what unfolded in Gaza, partly because of, as Michael noted, he got everything he wanted in the West Bank. I think now, sort of like the truth came out, okay? He's basically had it, and he also sees elections, and he wants to perhaps use an opportunity to break ideologically from what he thought was suboptimal performance by this government over everything that's been pushed down the throat in regards to what unfolds in Gaza, including allowing the biggest threat of them all, the moderate Palestinians, to emerge there in the form of the NCAG. As far as the elections, I'll just say this. I think the elections, it's very hard to predict. Some things are obvious, and we've seen the polls relatively stable for the past, 6 months to a year. But I think there are all kinds of moves that ultimately could affect or decide even the elections. And just as we, I think, got on, there was this report that Gadi Eisenkot, for example, proposed that Bennett, Lapid, and him join forces as one list to go into the elections. Such moves could dramatically also shift enough to decide the elections. So a lot more to come. This has not played itself out just yet.
Yeah, I have a feeling we'll be having some Zoom sessions about Israeli election maneuvering in the near future. That's my prediction for the year. Michael, I did want to come back to you for just the last word because earlier I asked you about what Trump's reaction might be to Hamas' refusal to disarm. And I want to come back to the Trump reaction to the Israeli government creating roadblocks towards the second phase, because there was so much anticipation of a potential Trump-Netanyahu clash in their meeting to end 2025 that instead appeared like a love fest. And there's been a lot of this discussion in the Israeli discourse as well about the looming potential clash. Maybe it's the announcement of the Board of Peace and the disagreement that Netanyahu is identifying with the Trump administration. Do you anticipate that there will be growing tensions in this relationship, or that there are, or are the Trump administration and the current government just being very successful at keeping those disagreements behind closed doors?
I think it's going to be increasingly hard to keep the disagreements behind closed doors. It seems like you have the US going in one direction and Israel not quite rowing in the same direction. You also, of course, have the Israeli election that Dan was just talking about, and that creates a whole set of other incentives. And you have various Israeli ministers, including the prime minister, saying things that are going to rub the Trump administration the wrong way. Reportedly, President Trump was not thrilled when Prime Minister Netanyahu brought up with him in December in Mar-a-Lago the idea that that U.S. security assistance to Israel would be wound down, and then Prime Minister Netanyahu went out and said it in an interview anyway. We've seen Vice President Vance, when he was in Israel in October, lash out at statements that were being made by Israeli ministers. Just yesterday, Bezalel Smotrich publicly called for the CMCC, which is run by the United States, to be shut down. We're seeing this play out in a number of arenas, and I think it's going to be increasingly hard for this calm, united front where everything's behind closed doors and there's no daylight, so to speak. I think it's going to be very hard for that to keep up, given everything that's going on and given the political pressures that are going to be brought to bear on all of this.
Great. Michael, Rachel, and Dan, thank you very much. I know you'll all be working on producing analysis and various reports to unpack all of these upcoming developments, as well as proposing ideas of possibilities moving forward. I want to thank everyone for joining us. Encourage you to visit our website, subscribe to receive the Koplow column, check out the Israel Policy Pod, and of course, please consider making a contribution to Israel Policy Forum. You could reach us at israelpolicyforum.org and find all that information. And we'll, of course, be in touch with you all by email regarding our next Zoom session, of which I am sure there will be many on the topic of Israeli politics and about all of the issues we talked about today. Michael, Rachel, and Dan, thanks so much, and we'll speak soon. Have a good day, guys.
Thank you.